edition of Auntie's Voices, writers reading their own work at Auntie's Bookstore in Spokane, Washington. I'm KPBX Arts producer Nancy Roth. 350 enthusiastic fans crowded into Auntie's huge new unfinished bookstore on November 16th to hear author Douglas Adams read from his classics Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, a nonfiction book, Last Chance to See, and a hilarious new book of definitions, The Deeper Meaning of Liff. Here's Douglas Adams on Auntie's Voices.
Thank you very much. Boy, I feel like a bit of a goldfish here. Does anybody have any copies of any of my books I can read from? Hang on, I'll just have to collect one or two. Hold on. This will be fine. I want Last Chance to See. Thanks. And they have Restaurant at the End of the Universe. They've got a copy of that one. Okay. I'm a great one for being prepared. You know, I'm going to start off reading some passages from the new book, Mostly Harmless. The bit I want to... Oh, God, I should have found it first. Yes. This passage... I was trying to explain when I last read this passage, you know, the context to people. That's rather difficult. So what I'm going to say is this comes about a third of the way into the book, and what has happened so far is the first third of the story. And and you kind of need to know that to understand what follows. You should also know, as a piece of background information to this, that at about the time that I was writing this, it was for my former the people who are now my former publishers in England. And I was getting extremely disgruntled with them and very unhappy with the whole way that the publishing company was going. And a lot of that stuff actually got poured into this chapter. Ford hurled himself at the door of the editor-in-chief's office, tucked himself into a tight ball as the frame splintered and gave way once again, rolled rapidly across the floor to where the smart grey crushed leather sofa was, and set up his strategic operational base behind it. That at least was the plan. Unfortunately, the smart grey crushed leather sofa wasn't there. Why, thought Ford, as he twisted himself around in midair, lurched, dove, and scuttled for cover behind Hal's desk, did people have this stupid obsession with rearranging their office furniture every 5 minutes? Why, for instance, replace a perfectly serviceable, if rather muted grey crushed leather sofa with what appeared to be a small tank? And who was the big guy with a mobile rocket launcher on his shoulder? Someone from head office? Couldn't be. This was head office. At least it was the head office of the Guide. Where these Infinidim Enterprises guys came from, Zarquan knew. No way expect corporate executives to be, even in today's rough-and-tumble business world. He was making a lot of assumptions here, of course. He was assuming that the big bull-necked slug-like guys were in some way connected with Infinidim Enterprises. But it was a reasonable assumption, and he felt happy about it because they had logos on their armor plating which said Infinidim Enterprises on them. He had a nagging suspicion that this was not a business meeting, though. He also had a nagging feeling that these slug-like creatures were familiar to him in some way. Familiar, but in an unfamiliar guise. Well, he'd been in the room for a good 2.5 seconds now, and thought it was probably about time to start doing something constructive. He could take a hostage. That would be good. Van Hal was in his swivel chair, looking alarmed, pale, and shaken. He probably had some bad news, as well as a nasty bang to the back of his head. Ford leapt to his feet and made a running grab of him. Under the pretext of getting him into a good solid double underpinned elbow lock, Ford managed surreptitiously to slip the identities back into Hal's inner pocket. Bingo, he'd done what he came to do. Now he just had to talk his way out of here. Okay, he said, He paused. The big guy with the rocket launcher was turning toward Ford Prefect and pointing it at him, which Ford couldn't help feeling was wildly irresponsible behavior. He started again, then on a sudden impulse decided to duck. There was a deafening roar as flames leapt from the back of the rocket launcher and a rocket leapt from the front. The rocket hurtled past forward and hit the large plate glass window, which billowed outward in a shower of 1,000,000 shards under the force of the explosion. Huge shockwaves of noise and air pressure reverberated around the room, sweeping a couple of chairs, a filing cabinet, and Colin the security robot out of the window. Ah, so they're not totally rocket-proof after all, thought Ford Prefect to himself. Someone should have a word with somebody about that. He disentangled himself from Hal and tried to work out which way to run. He was surrounded. The big guy with the rocket launcher was moving it up into position again for another shot. Ford was completely at a loss for what to do next. "Look," he said in a stern voice. But he wasn't certain how far saying things like "look" in a stern voice was necessarily going to get him, and time was not on his side. What the hell, he thought, you're only young once, and threw himself out of the window. That would at least keep the element of surprise on his side. We now pass on to Chapter 11 before we come back to those events. Chapter 11. The first thing Arthur Dent had to do, he realized resignedly, was to get himself a life. This meant he had to find a planet he could have one on. It had to be a planet he could breathe on, where he could stand up and sit down without experiencing gravitational discomfort. It had to be somewhere where the acid levels were low and the plants didn't actually attack you. "I hate to be anthropic about this," he said to the strange thing behind the desk at the Resettlement Advice Centre on Pintleton Alpha, "but I'd quite like to live somewhere where the people will sort of vaguely like me as well, sort of human." The strange thing behind the desk waved some of its stranger bits around and seemed rather taken aback by this. It oozed and glopped off its seat, thrashed its way slowly across the floor, ingested the old metal filing cabinet, and then, with a great belch, excreted the appropriate drawer. It popped out a couple of glistening tentacles from its ear, removed some files from the drawer, sucked the drawer back in, and vomited up the cabinet again. It thrashed its way back across the floor, slimed its way back up onto the seat, and slapped the files on the table. "See anything you fancy?" it asked. Arthur looked nervously through some grubby and damp pieces of paper. He was definitely in some backwater part of the galaxy here, and somewhere off to the left as far as the universe he knew and recognized was concerned. In the space where his own home should be, there was a rotten hick planet drowned with rain and inhabited by thugs and boghogs. Even the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy seemed to work only fitfully here, which is why he was reduced to making these sorts of inquiries in these sorts of places. One place he always asked after was Stavromula Beta, but no one had ever heard of such a planet. The available worlds looked pretty grim. They had little to offer him because he had little to offer them. He'd been extremely chastened to realize that although he originally came from a planet which had cars and computers and ballet and Armagnac, he didn't by himself know how any of it worked. He couldn't do it. Left to his own devices, he couldn't build a toaster. He could just about make a sandwich, and that was it. There was not a lot of demand for his services. Arthur's heart sank. This surprised him because he thought it was already about as low as it could possibly be. He closed his eyes for a moment. He so much wanted to be home. He just so much wanted his own home world, the actual earth he'd grown up on, not to have been demolished. He so much wanted none of this to have happened. He so much wanted that when he opened his eyes again, he would be standing on the doorstep of his little cottage in the west country of England, that the sun would be shining over the green hills, the post van would be going up the lane, the daffodils would be blooming in his garden, and in the distance, the pub would be opening for lunch. He so much wanted to take the newspaper down to the pub and read it over a pint of bitter. He so much wanted to do the crossword. He so much wanted to be able to get completely stuck on 17 across. He opened his eyes. The strange thing was pulsating irritably at him, tapping some kind of pseudopodia on the desk. Arthur shook his head and looked at the next sheet of paper. Grim, he thought, and the next. Very grim, and the next. Now that looked better. It was a world called Bartledam. It had oxygen. It had green hills. It even, it seemed, had renowned literary culture. But the thing that most aroused his interest was a photograph of a small bunch of Bartledanian people standing round in a village square, smiling pleasantly at the camera. "Ah," he said, and held up the picture to the strange thing behind the desk. Its eyes squirmed out on stalks and rolled up and down the piece of paper, leaving a glistening trail of slime all over it. "Yes," it said with distaste, "they do look exactly like you." Arthur moved to Bartledan, and using some money he had made by selling some toenail clippings and spit to a DNA bank, he bought himself a room in the village featured in the picture. It was pleasant there, the air was balmy, the people looked like him and seemed not to mind him being there. They didn't attack him with anything. He bought some clothes and a cupboard to put them in. He had got himself a life. Now he had to find a purpose in it. At first he tried to sit and read, but the literature of Bartledan, famed though it was throughout this sector of the galaxy for its subtlety and grace, didn't seem to be able to sustain his interest. The problem was that it wasn't actually about human beings after all. It wasn't about what human beings wanted. The people of Bartledan were remarkably like human beings to look at, but when you said "good evening" to one, he would tend to look around with a slight sense of surprise, sniff the air and say that, yes, he supposed that it probably was a goodish evening now that Arthur came to mention it. "No, what I meant was to wish you a good evening," Arthur would say, or rather used to say. He'd soon learn to avoid these conversations. "I mean that I hope you have a good evening," he would add. More puzzlement. "Wish?" the Bartledanian would say at last in polite bafflement. Yes," Arthur would then have said. "I'm just expressing the hope that..." "Hope?" "Yes. What is hope?" Good question, thought Arthur to himself, and retreated back to his room to think about things. On the one hand, he could only recognize and respect what he learned about the Bartledanian view of the universe, which was that the universe was what the universe was, take it or leave it. On the other hand, he could not help but feel that not to desire anything, nor ever to wish or to hope, was just not natural. Natural, now there was another tricky word. He had long ago realized that a lot of things that he had thought of as natural, like buying people presents at Christmas, stopping at red lights, or falling at a rate of 32 feet per second, were just habits of his own world and didn't necessarily work the same way anywhere else. But not to wish, that couldn't really be natural, could it? That would be like not breathing. Breathing was another thing the Bartledanians didn't do. Despite all the oxygen in the atmosphere, they just stood there. Occasionally they ran around and played netball and stuff, without ever wishing to win, though, of course. They would just play, and whoever won, won. But they never actually breathed. It was, for some reason, unnecessary. Arthur quickly learned that playing netball with them was just too spooky. Though they looked like humans and even moved and sounded like humans, they didn't breathe and they didn't wish for things. Breathing and wishing for things, on the other hand, was just about all Arthur seemed to do all day. Sometimes he'd wish for things so much that his breathing would get quite agitated. And he would have to go and lie down for a bit, on his own, in a small room, so far from the world that had given birth to him that his brain could not even process the sort of numbers involved without just going limp. He preferred not to think about it. He preferred just to sit and read. Or at least he would prefer it if there was anything worth reading. But nobody in Bartledanian stories ever wanted anything. Not even a glass of water. Certainly they would fetch one if they were thirsty, but if there wasn't one available, they would think no more about it. He had just read an entire book in which the main character had, over the course of a week, done some work in his garden, played a great deal of netball, helped mend a road, fathered a child on his wife, and then unexpectedly died of thirst just before the last chapter. In exasperation, Arthur had combed his way back through the book and in the end had found a passing reference to some problem with the plumbing in chapter 2. And that was it, till the guy dies. It just happens. It wasn't even the climax of the book, because there wasn't one. The character died about a third of the way through the penultimate chapter of the book, and the rest of it was just more stuff about road mending. The book just finished dead at the 100,000th word because that was how long books were on Bartledan. Arthur threw the book across the room, sold the room and left. He started to travel with wild abandon, trading in more and more spit, toenails, fingernails, blood, hair, anything that anybody wanted for tickets. For seamen, he discovered he could travel first class. He settled nowhere but only existed in the hermetic twilight world of the cabins of hyperspatial starships, eating, drinking, sleeping, watching movies, only stopping at spaceports to donate more DNA and catch the next long-haul ship out. He waited and waited for another accident to happen. The trouble with trying to make the right accident happen is that it won't. That is not what accident means. The accident that eventually occurred was not what he had planned at all. The ship he was on blipped in hyperspace, flickered horribly through between 97 different points in the galaxy simultaneously, caught the unexpected gravitational pull of an uncharted planet in one of them, became ensnared in its outer atmosphere, and began to fall, screaming and tearing into it. The ship's systems protested all the way down that everything was perfectly normal and under control. But when it went into its final hectic spin, ripped wildly through half a mile of trees, and finally exploded into a seething ball of flame, it became clear that this was not the case. Fire engulfed the forest, boiled into the night, then neatly put itself out. That's all unscheduled fires over a certain size are now required to do by law. For a short while afterward, other small fires flared up here and there as odd pieces of scattered debris exploded quietly in their own time. Then they too died away. Arthur, because of the sheer boredom of endless interstellar flight, was the only one on board who actually had familiarized himself with the ship's safety procedures in case of an unscheduled landing, was therefore the sole survivor. He lay dazed, broken and bleeding in a sort of fluffy pink plastic cocoon with "Have a nice day" printed in more than 3,000 different languages all over it. Black, roaring silences swam sickeningly through his shattered mind. He knew with a kind of resigned certainty that he would survive because he had not yet been to Stavromula Beta. After what seemed an eternity of pain and darkness, he became aware of quiet shapes moving around him. Chapter 12. Ford tumbled through the open air in a cloud of glass splinters and chair parts. Again, he hadn't really thought things through, really, and he was just playing it by ear, buying time. At times of major crisis, he found it was often quite helpful to have his life flash before his eyes. Gave him a chance to reflect on things, see things in some kind of perspective, and it sometimes furnished him with a vital clue as to what to do next. There was the ground rushing up to meet him at 30 feet per second, but he would, he thought, deal with that problem when he got to it. First things first. Here it came, his childhood. Humdrum stuff, he'd been through it all before. Images flashed by, boring times on Beetlejuice 5, Zaphod Beeblebrox as a kid. Yes, he knew all that. He wished he had some kind of fast forward in his brain. His 7th birthday party, being given his first towel. Come on, come on. He was twisting and turning downward the outside air at this height, a cold shock to his lungs, trying not to inhale glass. Early voyages to other planets. Oh, for Zark's sake, this is like some sort of bloody travelogue documentary before the main feature. First beginning to work for the guide. Those were the days. They worked out of a hut on the Buenelli Atoll on Fanala before the Rictonacles and the Donqueds vertled it. Half a dozen guys, some towels, a handful of highly sophisticated digital devices, and most important, a lot of dreams. No, most important, a lot of Fanalan rum. To be absolutely accurate, that old jank spirit was the absolute most important thing, then the Fanalan rum, and also some of the beaches on the atoll where the local girls would hang out. But the dreams were important as well. Whatever happened to those? We couldn't quite remember what the dreams were, in fact, but they had certainly seemed immensely important at the time. They had certainly not involved this huge, towering office block he was now falling down the side of. All of that had come when some of the original team had started to settle down and get greedy, while he and others had stayed out in the field researching and hitchhiking and gradually becoming more and more isolated from the corporate nightmare the guide had inexorably turned into, and the architectural monstrosity it had come to occupy. Where were the dreams in that? He thought of all the corporate lawyers who occupied half of the building, all of the operatives who occupied the lower levels, and all the sub-editors and their secretaries lawyers, and their secretaries lawyers' secretaries, and worst of all, the accountants and the marketing department. He had half a mind just to keep on falling, the finger to the lot of them. He was just passing the 17th floor now, where the marketing department hang out. Load of tosspots all arguing about what colour the guide should be and exercising their infinitely infallible skills of being wise after the event. If any of them had chosen to look out of the window at that moment, they would have been startled by the sight of Ford Prefect dropping past them to his certain death and flipping the finger at them. 16th floor, sub-editors, bastards. What about all that copy of his they cut? 15 years of research he'd filed from one planet alone, and they cut it to 2 words, mostly harmless. The finger to them as well. 15th floor, logical administration, whatever that was about. They all had big cars. That, he thought, was what that was about. 14th floor, personnel. He had a very shrewd suspicion that it was they who had engineered his 15-year exile while the guide metamorphosed into the corporate monolith, or rather duolith, mustn't forget the lawyers, it had become. 13th floor, research and development. Hang about. 13th floor. He was having to think rather fast at the moment because the situation was becoming a little urgent. And he suddenly remembered the floor display panel in the elevator. It hadn't had a 13th floor. He thought no more about it because, having spent 15 years on the rather backward planet Earth, where they were superstitious about the number 13, he was used to being in buildings that numbered their floors without it. No reason for that here, though. The windows on the 13th floor, he could not help noticing as he flashed swiftly by them, were darkened. What was going on in there? He started to remember all the stuff that Hal had been talking about. One new multi-dimensional guide spread across an infinite number of universes. It had sounded, the way Hal had put it, like wild meaninglessness dreamed up by the marketing department and with the backing of the accountants. If it was any more real than that, then it was a very weird and dangerous idea. Was it real? What was going on behind the darkened windows of the sealed-off 13th floor? Ford felt a rising sense of curiosity, and then a rising sense of panic. That was the complete list of rising feelings he had. In every other respect, he was falling very rapidly. He really ought to turn his mind to wondering how he was going to get out of the situation alive. He glanced down. 100 feet or so below him, people were milling around, some of them beginning to look up expectantly, clearing a space for him. Even temporarily calling off the wonderful and completely fatuous hunt for wockets. He would hate to disappoint them, but about 2 feet below him, he hadn't realized before, was Colin. Colin, I should explain to those who are not familiar with what I'm reading, was a small, round, sort of melon-shaped security robot that that Ford had persuaded to be happy. Colin had obviously been happily dancing attendance and waiting for him to decide what to do. "Colin!" Ford bawled. Colin didn't respond. Ford went cold. Then he suddenly realized that he hadn't told Colin his name was Colin. "Come up here!" Ford bawled. Colin bobbed up beside him. Colin was enjoying the ride down immensely and hoped that Ford was too. Colin's world went unexpectedly dark as Ford's towel suddenly enveloped him. Colin immediately felt himself get much, much heavier. He was thrilled and delighted by the challenge that Ford had presented him with, just not sure if he could handle it, that was all. The towel was slung over Colin. Ford was hanging from the towel, gripping to its seams. Other hitchhikers had seen fit to modify their towels in exotic ways, weaving all kinds of esoteric tools and utilities and even computer equipment into their fabric. Ford was a purist. He liked to keep things simple. He carried a regular towel from a regular domestic soft furnishings shop. It even had a kind of blue and pink floral pattern, despite his repeated attempts to bleach and stonewash it. It had a couple of pieces of wire threaded into it, a bit of flexible writing stick, and also some nutrients soaked into one of the corners of the fabric, so he could suck on it in an emergency. But otherwise, it was a simple towel you could dry your face on. The only actual modification he had been persuaded by a friend to make to it was to reinforce the seams. Ford gripped the seams like a maniac. They were still descending, but the rate had slowed. "Up, Colin!" he shouted. Nothing. "Your name," shouted Ford, "is Colin. So when I shout, 'Up, Colin,' I want you, Colin, to go up. Okay? Up, Colin!" Nothing. Or rather a sort of muffled groaning sound from Colin. Ford was very anxious. They were descending very slowly now, but Ford was very anxious about the sort of people he could see assembling on the ground beneath him. Friendly local rocket hunting types were dispersing, and thick, heavy, bull-necked, slug-like creatures with rocket launchers were, it seemed, sliding out of what was usually called thin air. Thin air, as all experienced galactic travellers well know, is in fact extremely thick with multi-dimensional complexities. "Up!" bellowed Ford. "Up, Colin! Go up!" Colin was straining and groaning. They were now more or less stationary in the air. Ford felt as if his fingers were breaking. "Up!" They stayed put. "Up, up, up!" A slug was preparing to launch a rocket at him. Ford couldn't believe it. He was hanging from a towel in mid-air, and a slug was preparing to fire rockets at him. He was running out of anything he could think of doing, and was beginning to get seriously alarmed. This is the sort of predicament that he usually relied on having the guide available for to give advice, however infuriating or glib. But this was not a moment for reaching into his pocket. And the guide seemed to be no longer a friend, an ally, but was now itself a source of danger. These were the guide offices he was hanging outside, for Zark's sake, in danger of his life from the people who now appeared to own the thing. What had become of all the dreams he vaguely remembered having had on the Buenelli Atoll? They should have let it all be. They should have stayed there, stayed on the beach, loved good women, lived on fish. He should have known it was all wrong the moment they started hanging grand pianos over the sea monster pool in the atrium. He began to feel thoroughly wasted and miserable. His fingers were on fire with clenched pain, and his ankle was still hurting. "Oh, thank you, ankle," he thought to himself bitterly. "Thank you for bringing up your problems at this time. I expect you'd like a nice warm foot bath to make you feel better, wouldn't you? Or at least you'd like me to..." He had an idea. The armoured slug had hoisted the rocket launcher up onto its shoulder. The rocket was presumably designed to hit anything in its path that moved. Ford tried not to sweat because he could feel his grip on the seams of his towel slipping. With the toe of his good foot, he nudged and pried the heel of the shoe on his hurting foot. "Go up, damn you!" Ford muttered hopelessly to Colin, who was cheerily straining away but unable to rise. Ford worked away at the heel of his shoe. He was trying to judge the timing, but there was no point. Just go for it. He only had one shot, and that was it. He had now eased the back of his shoe down off his heel. His twisted ankle felt a little better. Well, that was good, wasn't it? With his other foot, he kicked at the heel of the shoe. It slipped off his foot and fell through the air. About half a second later, a rocket erupted from the muzzle of its launcher, encountered the shoe falling through its path, went straight for it, hit it, and exploded with a great sense of satisfaction and achievement. This happened about 15 feet from the ground. The main force of the explosion was directed downward, where, a second earlier, there had been a squad of Infinidim Enterprises executives with a rocket launcher standing on an elegant terraced plaza paved with large slabs of lustrous stone cut from the ancient alabastrum quarries of the Central Quabula. There was now instead a bit of a pit with nasty bits in it. A great whomp of hot air welled up from the explosion, throwing Ford and Colin violently up into the sky. Ford fought desperately and blindly to hold on and failed. He turned helplessly upward through the sky, reached the peak of a parabola, paused, and then started to fall again. He fell and fell and fell, and suddenly winded himself badly on Colin, who was still rising. He clasped himself desperately onto the small spherical robot. Colin slewed wildly through the air toward the tower of the guide offices, trying delightedly to control himself and slow down. The world spun sickeningly around Ford's head as they spun and twisted round each other, and then, equally sickeningly, everything suddenly stopped. Ford found himself deposited dizzily on a window ledge. There's another book I have out at the moment that's newly published over here that was published in England a little while ago. It's called Deeper Meaning of Life, which is a kind of dictionary. It's a dictionary of meanings that there aren't any words for yet, but there ought to be. Now, this all happened. This started out when I was 11, and one day our English master came into class and gave us each a place name. He said, each of you, I want you to think of this place name, forget that it is the name of a place, forget about all those associations, just think of it as a word. What does the word mean? And the word he gave me was Clacton, which is a little English seaside town. And I decided that a Clacton was one of those people you don't see anymore. He used to sort of walk up and down the side of trains tapping the wheels to see if they were sound. I was not aware, of course, that there is actually a proper technical term for people who tap the wheels of trains, which is wheel tappers. But anyway, that's what I decided a Clacton was. And it was immense fun, that particular class we had that day. But we never ever got to do it again, and I spent the whole of the rest of my school career in a sort of constant state of disappointment. Then, many years later, it was about 1978, myself and a bunch of friends were on holiday together in Greece. And at one point, we were sitting in a taverna at lunchtime, having lunch, drinking Retsina, and playing charades. And after a while, because of the amount of Retsina we'd had to drink, we needed to find a game that involved less standing up. And so I then remembered this thing that I'd done in class, and we started just giving each other place names and sort of challenging the other to come up with a meaning for it. And it turned out immediately to be, to get us all going. Now, I'm just trying to remember some of the ones from that very, very first day, like Woking, which is a rather large, boring town just to the west of London. Woking, I decided, was... Woking, I decided, was standing in the kitchen wondering what you'd come in here for. What else did we come up with that day? Kettering. Kettering is the marks you get on the underside of your bottom and thigh when you've been sitting sunbathing in a wickerwork chair. And Ely, E-L-Y, Ely, is the first tiniest inkling you get that something somewhere has gone terribly wrong. What immediately became apparent to us was, as we started identifying these, putting these words together with meanings, was that there were an awful lot of experiences, sensations, situations, observations that we all knew and were familiar with, but had always been private up to ourselves up to now, because it never occurred to us that anybody else had them, because there wasn't a word for it. So we began to realize that the way in which we live our lives and the way we perceive it is actually very much limited by the words we have to describe it. So we thought, well, we've got to get some more words into the language. And place names are the ideal things to do it with. And so we, over that lunchtime, we collected a lot. And then a little while later, decided we were actually going to do a book based on it. And so John Lloyd, who's my co-author on this, who's a major television producer in England, John Lloyd and myself, I have to explain, the life of a writer is pretty tough. It's tough, lonely work. We rented a beach house in Malibu and got in a load of beers, sat on the beach and basically came up with silly ideas. And let me give you an example of some of the ones we came up with. No, that's a very rude one, I can't do that. Missoul is a mixture of toothpaste and saliva in a wash basin. A liff, incidentally, is a common object or experience for which no word yet exists. Kelling is the action of looking for something all over again in all the places you've already looked. Kimmerage is the light breeze that blows through your armpit hair when you're stretched out sunbathing. Jeffers are persons who honestly believe that a business lunch is going to achieve anything. Duane is only slightly relevant to the matter in hand. Greeley is someone who continually annoys you by continually apologizing for annoying you. Gress. Gress is a very, very rare word that one hardly ever finds a use for. It means to stick to the point during a family argument. Golant is blank, sly, and faintly embarrassed, pertaining to the expression seen on the face of someone who has clearly forgotten your name. A sketty is the small little dance, self-propelled dance that a beer glass performs in its own puddle. An afcot is a sort of fart you hope some people will talk after. Acklins are the odd twinges you get in parts of your body when you scratch other parts. I've always wondered if that's the origin of acupuncture. Mimbridge is that which two very boring people have in common, which enables you to get away from them. And the Hobbs cross is the awkward leaping maneuver that a woman has to perform in order to get him to sleep in the wet patch. This book, I should explain, the last one I'm going to give you is an explanation that this book itself is the perfect solution to the problem of great wakering. Great wakering is the panic which sets in when you badly need to go to the lavatory and cannot make up your mind about what book or magazine to take with you. Now, my publisher was saying to me the other day that he has a theory that all novelists he knows have a favourite book of their own, and it's always, he says, it's always the one non-fiction book that they've written. And that's certainly true in my case. My favourite book of my own is a book called Last Chance to See, which was the account of a series of expeditions I undertook with a zoologist friend of mine. Yes, somebody's waving at the back. Yes, thank you. To look for a number of rare and endangered species of animal. Now I want to do this on the grounds that I didn't actually know anything about them, and I thought it was about time that I did. And one of the animals we went to look for was the Komodo dragon lizard. Now the Komodo dragon lizard is the most extraordinary animal. It's a lizard for which I think the technical term is big. The ones we saw were typically about 10 feet big. They were 10 feet long. The biggest one we saw was actually 12 feet long, and their head comes up to about this height. They're thought to be the origin of the Chinese dragon myth, because they are giant lizards. They are man-eaters. Quite seriously, they are man-eaters. And though they don't actually breathe fire, they do have the worst breath of any creature known to man. Now, the island on which they live is called Komodo. And the island, just to make the island a little bit interesting, as well as having 1,500 giant man-eating lizards at large on it, it also has, by way of a bonus, more poisonous snakes than any equivalent area of land anywhere on Earth. I have to say that we approached Komodo nervously, tentatively, from a distance. We actually approached it via Melbourne. But there was a reason why we went via Melbourne. There was somebody we wanted to go and see there who we thought might be able to help us with confronting the snake problem. I should explain before I read this passage that I'm afraid I'm not actually very good at doing an Australian accent. But anyway, what the hell, you're all Americans, you're not going to know the difference anyway. There is in Melbourne a man who probably knows more about poisonous snakes than anyone else on Earth. His name is Dr. Struan Sutherland, and he has devoted his entire life to a study of snake venom. And I'm bored with it, he said when we went along to see him the next morning. Can't stand all these poisonous creatures, all these snakes and insects and fish and things, wretched things biting everybody. And then people expect me to tell them what to do about it. I'll tell them what to do. Don't get bitten in the first place. That's the answer. I've had enough of telling people all the time. Hydroponics, now that's interesting. Talk to you all you like about hydroponics. Fascinating stuff. Growing plants artificially in water. Very interesting technique. We'll need to know all about it if we're going to go to Mars and places. Where did you say you were going? Komodo. Well, don't get bitten, that's all I can say. And don't come running to me if you do, because you won't get here in time. And anyway, I've got enough on my plate. Look at this office, full of poisonous animals all over the place. See this tank? It's full of fire ants, venomous little creatures. What are we going to do with them? Anyway, I got some little cakes in case you were hungry. Would you like some little cakes? I can't remember where I put them. There's some tea, but it's not very good. Anyway, sit down for heaven's sake. So, you're going to Komodo. Well, I don't know why you want to do that, but I suppose you have your reasons. There are 15 different types of snake on Komodo, and half of them are poisonous. The only potentially deadly ones are the Russell's viper, the bamboo viper, and the Indian cobra. The Indian cobra is the 15th deadliest snake in the world. And all the other 14 are here in Australia. That's why it's so hard for me to find time to get on with my hydroponics. All these snakes all over the place. And spiders. The most poisonous spider is the Sydney funnel web. We get about 500 people a year bitten by spiders. A lot of them used to die, so we had to develop an antidote to stop people bothering me with it all the time. Took us years. Then we developed the snake bite detector kit. Not that you need a kit to tell you when you've been bitten by a snake, you usually know. But the kit is something that'll detect what type you've been bitten by so you can treat it properly. Would you like to see a kit? I've got a couple in the venom fridge. Let's have a look. Oh, look, the cakes are in here too. Quick, have one while they're still fresh. Fairy cakes are baked in myself. He handed round the snake venom detection kits and his home-baked fairy cakes and retreated back to his desk, where he beamed at us cheerfully from behind his curly beard and bow tie. We admired the kits, which were small, efficient boxes, neatly packed with tiny bottles, a pipette, a syringe, and a complicated set of instructions that I wouldn't want to have to read for the first time in a panic. And then we asked how many of the snakes he'd been bitten by himself. None of them, he said. Another area of expertise I've developed is that of getting other people to handle the dangerous animals. Won't do it myself, don't want to get bitten, do I? You know what it says on my book jackets? Hobbies, gardening with gloves, fishing with boots, travelling with care. That's the answer. What else? Well, in addition to the boots, wear thick baggy trousers and preferably have half a dozen people tramping along in front of you making as much noise as possible. The snakes pick up the vibrations and get out of your way, unless it's a death adder, otherwise known as a deaf adder, which just lies there. People can walk right past it and over it and nothing happens. I've heard of 12 people in a line walking over a death adder, and the 12th person accidentally trod on it and got bitten. Normally you're quite safe if you're 12th in line. You're not eating your cakes. Come on, get them down here. There's plenty more in the venom fridge. We asked tentatively if we could perhaps take a snakebite detector kit with us to Komodo. Of course you can, of course you can. Take as many as you like. Won't do you blind, but are good, because they're only for Australian snakes. So, what do we do if we get bitten by something deadly then? I asked. He looked at me as if I was stupid. Well, what do you think you do, he said. You die, of course, that's what deadly means. But what about cutting open the wound and sucking out the poison, I asked. Well, rather you than me, he said. I wouldn't want a mouthful of poison. Shouldn't do you any harm, though, and snake toxins have a high molecular weight, so they won't penetrate the blood vessels in the mouth the way that alcohol or some drugs do, and then the poison gets destroyed by the acids in your stomach. But it's not necessarily going to do much good either. You're not likely to be able to get much of the poison out, but you're probably going to make the wound a lot worse trying. And in a place like Komodo, it means you'd quickly have a seriously infected wound to contend with, as well as a leg full of poison. Septicemia, gangrene, you name it, it'll kill you. What about a tourniquet? Well, fine if you don't mind having your leg off afterwards. You'd have to, because if you cut off the blood supply to it completely, it'll just die. And if you can find anyone, but not too tightly. Slow the blood flow, but don't cut it off or you'll lose the leg. Hold your leg, or whatever bit you've been bitten in, lower than your heart and your head. Keep very, very still. Breathe slowly and get to a doctor immediately. If you're on Komodo, that means a couple of days, by which time you'll be well dead. Now, the only answer, and I mean this quite seriously, is don't get bitten. There's no reason why you should. Any of the snakes there will get out of your way well before you even see them. You don't really need to worry about the snakes if you're careful. No, the things you really need to worry about are the marine creatures. What? Scorpion, fish, stonefish, sea snakes, much more poisonous than anything on land. Get stung by a stonefish, this pain alone can kill you. People drown themselves just to stop the pain. Where are all these things? Oh, just in the sea, tons of them. I wouldn't go near it if I were you. Full of poisonous animals, hate them. Is there anything you do like? Yeah, he said, hydroponics. Now, I mean, is there any venomous creature you're particularly fond of? He looked out of the window for a moment. There was, he said, but she left me.